There is a moment in almost every long-term relationship when something subtle but decisive begins to change. It's rarely dramatic at first. No shouting, no sudden breakups, no visible betrayal. It starts with an absence. The woman, once completely devoted, starts to drift away. Her eyes no longer linger. Her voice loses its warmth. Her touch becomes distant. She begins to withdraw into silence. Her phone, once left carelessly on the table, is now always turned face down. When you ask what's wrong, she says she's just tired, that she's fine, that it's just stress. But deep inside, something essential has already shifted. Most men have no idea what is happening when this begins. They think it's just a phase, that work, children, or routine have taken their toll. They imagine that love is a flame that naturally fades over time. They don't realize that what is fading is not love, it's dopamine. Every human relationship, romantic or not, is sustained by a complex balance of brain chemistry. At the beginning, dopamine dominates. It is the neurotransmitter of pursuit, desire, and novelty. It gives rise to obsession, euphoria, anticipation. It's the same chemical released when someone wins a bet, tries a new drug, or receives unexpected attention. It is addictive, and its presence makes everything shine with the false light of eternity. But dopamine cannot last forever. When a relationship stabilizes and turns into routine, oxytocin takes over, the bonding hormone, the one responsible for affection, loyalty, and long-term attachment. The problem is that oxytocin is calm, not thrilling. It doesn't produce the same rush. And that's where the seed of discontent begins to grow. Many women mistake this natural transition for the death of passion. They interpret the emotional quietness as emptiness, the stability as stagnation. That's when the temptation of novelty begins to whisper. It's not necessarily about another man at first. It's about a craving for the feeling of being desired, of being chased, of being fascinating again. In biochemical terms, what she really wants is another shot of dopamine. When that feeling fades, she doesn't understand that it's not the man she's bored with, it's the brain adapting. She misses the chemical storm that once made her heart race and her thoughts spiral. And if she doesn't recognize this, if she doesn't learn to interpret her boredom as a stage rather than a sign, she will begin to unconsciously seek a new source of stimulation. That's why so many betrayals begin not with sex but with attention. A compliment from a coworker. A message from an old acquaintance. The feeling of being seen again after years of invisibility. Each of these moments triggers a tiny release of dopamine, like a drop of an old drug. And slowly, the neural pathways that once linked pleasure to her partner start linking it to the new stimulus. The rest is just chemistry fulfilling its function. Women who fall into this pattern don't usually plan to. It's not a deliberate strategy. It's a drift, small, almost invisible steps that lead from emotional fatigue to emotional betrayal. At first, it's just a little secret, a harmless text, a hidden smile, a message that could be deleted but isn't. Soon, she begins to fantasize, to compare, to rewrite her past in a way that justifies what she's about to do. I've never really been happy, she tells herself. Maybe I settled too early. Maybe I deserve to feel alive again. And here lies one of the darkest truths about female betrayal. It almost never begins as cruelty. It begins as a search for emotional relief. But the relief soon becomes dependence. Because each new interaction with the forbidden person, each secret exchange, reinforces the same addictive cycle that created the initial infatuation. It's not the new man she's addicted to. It's the version of herself that appears when he looks at her. The woman who betrays often does so not because she stopped loving her partner, but because she stopped recognizing herself in the mirror of his eyes. The familiar no longer excites her, and the unfamiliar becomes a doorway to a new identity. She wants to be desired, not by just anyone, but by someone who makes her feel like a different woman. That's the real seduction, the illusion of transformation. It's important to understand that dopamine doesn't care about morality, family, or promises. It only seeks novelty. And once the brain associates novelty with pleasure, routine becomes suffocating. That's why, no matter how loving or stable a relationship is, if it lacks a sense of discovery, the chemical bond begins to fade. But there is a tragedy in this dynamic. Because when she leaves in search of excitement, she imagines she's pursuing happiness. In reality, she's chasing the withdrawal symptoms of a chemical imbalance. What she calls love is often just the brain's desperate attempt to recreate the thrill of an earlier high. And like any addict, once the effect fades, she'll need a stronger dose, a new man, a new story, a new emotional drama. Depth of Men explores this not to judge, but to expose what most people refuse to see. In modern culture, betrayal is portrayed as empowerment, as self-discovery, as following your heart. But the heart is not a compass, it's a muscle responding to chemical fluctuations. What we call following your feelings is often just surrendering to biochemical chaos. The woman who truly understands her own nature learns to distrust her impulses. She knows that the thrill of new love is not love itself, but a temporary madness. She learns to recognize the moment when her brain tries to deceive her, when boredom whispers that she's missing something, when her imagination paints the ordinary as unbearable. That's when real wisdom begins, when she resists the call of dopamine and chooses the stability of oxytocin instead. The collapse of a relationship rarely happens when a woman leaves. It begins long before that, when she stops admiring. Love can survive conflicts, arguments, and even distance, but it cannot survive the slow erosion of respect. When a woman no longer looks at a man with admiration, the emotional foundation dissolves. She might still care for him, she might even stay, but her desire dies quietly. She starts to see him as predictable, domesticated, safe, and therefore invisible. A man's tragedy is that he often doesn't notice this transformation. He believes love is maintained through words or routine gestures, not through polarity. He doesn't understand that for a woman to feel attraction, she must feel admiration. She must see in him something she cannot fully control, something slightly beyond her grasp. When he loses that edge, when he becomes too compliant, too available, too apologetic, she doesn't feel safe, she feels bored. This boredom is the silent killer of modern relationships. It's not the absence of love, but the absence of tension. The masculine energy, when healthy, doesn't seek approval, it radiates direction. A man anchored in purpose, who doesn't orbit around a woman's moods, naturally generates the polarity that sustains desire. When he forgets this and tries to please instead of lead, he unknowingly dissolves the very chemistry that once attracted her. In the early days of love, this dynamic happens naturally. The man pursues, the woman tests, and both play in a dance of uncertainty. But when the pursuit ends and comfort takes its place, the dance freezes. She no longer feels the current of attraction, he no longer feels the challenge of conquest. And in that stillness, resentment begins to breed. She starts to interpret his kindness as weakness, his patience as passivity, his affection as neediness. Meanwhile, he interprets her distance as emotional cruelty. But what's really happening is a collapse of polarity. She's starving for the charge that once electrified their bond, and he's lost the masculine presence that once provided it. Depth of Men speaks of this collapse because it's the unspoken truth of our era. Men have been domesticated emotionally, and women have been taught to despise the very masculinity they secretly crave. The result is a generation of relationships without fire, comfortable but cold, safe but lifeless. A woman who leaves such a man often does so not out of hatred, but out of an instinct for vitality. She wants to feel alive again. But what she doesn't realize is that she's not running from the man, she's running from the mirror of her own disconnection. Because the truth is that passion isn't something you find in another, it's something you cultivate through polarity. And polarity begins with self-respect. When a woman loses respect for a man, it's usually because he lost respect for himself first. The masculine is meant to lead, to carry direction, to remain grounded even when emotions storm around him. But when he bends to every emotional wave to avoid conflict, when he abandons his own vision to maintain peace, he ceases to be a man in her eyes. He becomes a boy seeking approval. And nothing kills desire faster than a man who seeks permission to be himself. But what about forgiveness? What about those who wake up too late, when the betrayal has already happened, when the woman has already crossed the invisible line? Forgiveness is possible in theory, but not in chemistry. You can forgive with words, you can even rebuild trust intellectually, but you cannot force your nervous system to forget. Once betrayal has occurred, something in the masculine psyche fractures irreversibly. For a man, betrayal is not just about the act, it's about what it reveals. It shows him that the bond he believed sacred was conditional, that her loyalty was dependent on emotional stimulation rather than moral conviction. This revelation changes everything. Because men, by nature, build identity through trust. Their ability to open up, to commit, to love deeply, all depend on a sense of safety in their partner's devotion. When that safety is destroyed, a part of them shuts down permanently. They can remain physically present, but emotionally, they retreat into a silent distance. That's why many men never fully recover from betrayal. They may continue in new relationships, they may even find love again, but something fundamental remains guarded. The innocence that once allowed them to surrender completely is gone. What remains is a quiet vigilance, a subtle, permanent mistrust of the feminine heart. And the cruel irony is that most women who betray never fully understand what they've destroyed. They imagine it's just a mistake, something that can be fixed with time, apologies, or proof of change. They don't realize that they've broken something sacred in the masculine soul, his capacity to believe. Depth of men often returns to this point. Forgiveness is not restoration. You can forgive someone and still never see them the same way again. In relationships, betrayal leaves a chemical trace, a neural imprint that time does not erase. The image of her with another man becomes an archetype of disillusion, a wound encoded in the masculine psyche. And yet, from this destruction, a strange kind of wisdom can emerge. Some men, instead of hardening into cynicism, awaken. They begin to see the patterns, the games of attraction, the illusions of romance, the cycles of emotional dependency. They stop idealizing women as pure, instinct-driven beings and start to understand them as complex, conflicted, and deeply human. This awakening hurts, but it liberates. The man who awakens no longer seeks validation in a woman's admiration. He learns to build polarity not through dominance, but through presence. He becomes the center of his own gravity. And from that center, he can love again, not as a naive boy hoping to be completed, but as a sovereign man who chooses to share his completeness. When a man reaches that stage, when the illusions burn away, he begins to see the feminine not as salvation but as reflection. She mirrors his own state of being. If he is grounded, she becomes calm. If he is lost, she becomes chaotic. What men often misinterpret as female unpredictability is, in many cases, a reflection of their own instability. The masculine sets the emotional tone, even when he doesn't realize it. This truth is difficult to accept because modern culture has inverted the ancient order. Men are told to be sensitive, to follow their emotions, to become soft in order to be loved. But a man who abandons his inner axis for emotional comfort loses both his power and his woman's attraction. A woman does not fall in love with softness, she falls in love with depth. She needs to feel that her emotional storms cannot shake him, that his presence is an anchor in her chaos. When that anchor disappears, she begins to drift. And once she starts drifting, another man's presence, firm, mysterious, unyielding, becomes magnetically appealing. It's not about beauty, wealth, or status. It's about polarity. Her biology responds to what her ideology denies. In truth, many modern women live in conflict between their psychological conditioning and their biological instincts. They are taught to desire equality, but their bodies still crave polarity. They want safety, but they also crave excitement. They want stability, but they long for mystery. And when these contradictions collide, confusion follows. Depth of Men reveals this paradox not to criticize women, but to expose the fractures of our era. We have built a culture that worships comfort but secretly desires danger. That glorifies equality but thrives on polarity. That preaches independence but collapses into emotional addiction. A man who understands this no longer reacts to surface behaviors. He sees through them. When a woman tests him, he doesn't take it personally. He recognizes the biological logic beneath the chaos. Every test is a question unspoken. Can you still lead me? Can you still be trusted when I push against you? If the man reacts with anger or weakness, the answer becomes no. But if he remains steady, calm, firm, unshaken, she relaxes. Respect returns. The modern masculine crisis is not that men have become bad, it's that they've become neutral. Neither dangerous nor dependable, just soft. And in the absence of polarity, women oscillate between domination and resentment. They crave strength but despise submission. They want leadership but fear dependence. It's a tragic loop of spiritual confusion. A woman cannot fully love a man she does not respect. And she cannot respect a man who depends on her approval. That is the cruel symmetry of the feminine psyche. She will test until she finds something immovable. Once she does, she can surrender. Not as submission, but as trust. The man who reclaims this polarity does not do it by controlling her. He does it by mastering himself. His calmness becomes his power. His silence becomes his language. His presence becomes her peace. But there is another, deeper layer, one that lies beneath betrayal, polarity, and chemistry. It is the question of identity itself. Who are we inside relationships? Are we truly loving the other person, or are we merely seeking in them the missing pieces of ourselves? When love begins, we believe we are connecting with another soul. In truth, we are connecting with an image, an archetype projected by our own mind. The lover becomes a mirror for our deepest desires and wounds. We fall in love not with who they are, but with who we become in their presence. That's why love can feel divine at first. It's the reflection of our ideal self. But as time passes, the illusion fades. We begin to see the other person not as the embodiment of our fantasy, but as a flawed, complex human being. And that's when love either matures or dies. To mature means to accept that the person before us will never complete us. To die means to reject that truth and start chasing the illusion again, usually in someone new. This cycle, idealization, disillusion, and escape, is the emotional addiction that drives most modern relationships. We call it romance, but it's actually avoidance. We are running from ourselves, using others as mirrors to temporarily silence the loneliness of being. Depth of Men speaks of this because true masculinity begins when the man stops running. When he faces his own emptiness without trying to fill it with validation, sex, or control. When he learns to sit in silence without needing anyone to reflect him back. That is when he becomes dangerous, not to others, but to the illusions that once ruled him. A man like this doesn't fall in love out of need. He loves as an act of abundance. He doesn't seek a woman to escape loneliness. He chooses her to expand presence. And because his love is not born from lack, it doesn't collapse when novelty fades. It deepens. Women can feel this difference instantly. A man who needs them drains them. A man who carries his own wholeness energizes them. The feminine, by nature, flows toward strength, toward emotional gravity. When a man becomes that gravity, not through force, but through stillness, she feels safe to surrender. Not because she's weak, but because her own chaos has finally found its container. True intimacy begins there, When both the masculine and the feminine stop chasing stimulation and start cultivating depth. When they stop asking, "What do I get from you?" and begin asking, "What truth can we face together?" In that space, betrayal loses its power, dopamine loses its tyranny, and love ceases to be a drug. It becomes what it was meant to be, a practice of consciousness. The rarest form of love is not the one that burns with passion, nor the one that comforts with security. It is the one that illuminates consciousness. In that kind of love, the purpose of the relationship is not pleasure or permanence, it is awakening. Each argument becomes a mirror of hidden wounds, each attraction a revelation of unconscious needs. The relationship becomes an alchemical process where two people dissolve illusions in order to find something real beneath them. But very few are willing to endure this kind of intimacy. Most people want the feeling of love, not the transformation it demands. Because to truly love someone means to let go of your masks. It means to allow the other to see you, not the curated self you show to the world, but the raw, insecure, unpolished self you hide from yourself. That is why authentic relationships are so rare. They require courage, not comfort. The man who has gone through betrayal and disillusionment, and still chooses to love, has reached a higher form of awareness. He no longer loves to possess, to control, or to prove his worth. He loves because he understands the sacred function of polarity, that the feminine is not his opposite, but his completion in consciousness. He no longer fears her chaos, because he has learned to navigate his own. Depth of Men calls this the sacred masculine, not dominance, not submission, but alignment. It's the state of being in which a man no longer reacts from fear or pride, but acts from clarity. He doesn't suppress emotion, he channels it. He doesn't chase meaning through women, he expresses meaning through presence. In this space, the woman beside him begins to change as well. Her anxiety softens, her distrust dissolves, her need to test vanishes. Because she can feel, often beyond words, that she is safe in the gravity of a man who doesn't flinch. She can finally rest. And when a woman rests, love flows naturally again. But this kind of love demands death, the death of illusion. The man must let go of his fantasies of control. The woman must let go of her fantasies of rescue. Only when both surrender their egos can they meet in truth. This is the stage where chemistry transforms into devotion. Not devotion to a person, but to a shared state of consciousness. When two people reach this level, betrayal becomes impossible, not because they are saints, but because there is nothing left to escape from. They are no longer addicted to stimulation, they are grounded in reality. And yet, even here, the shadow remains. Desire still flickers, boredom still threatens, fear still whispers. The difference is awareness. They no longer identify with these movements, they observe them. Love becomes meditation in motion. This is the hidden purpose of every heartbreak, to push us toward truth. Pain burns away the illusions we refuse to surrender voluntarily. Every betrayal, every loss, every disillusionment is a purification, brutal, yes, but sacred. Because in losing what was false, we finally become capable of receiving what is real. Depth of Men is not a message of despair, but of awakening. It speaks to those who have seen too much to believe in romantic myths, yet still refuse to surrender to cynicism. It's for men who want to understand women not through resentment, but through clarity, and for women who want to see men beyond their projections. We live in a time when relationships are collapsing not because people are evil, but because they are unconscious. They mistake emotional intensity for love, validation for connection, and chemistry for compatibility. They enter relationships to escape loneliness, only to discover that loneliness follows them wherever they go, because it was never about others. It was about the emptiness within. The only path out of this cycle is depth. Not more partners, not more distractions, not more stimulation. Depth. The courage to look inside and face the raw, uncomfortable truth of who you are when no one is watching. The courage to stop blaming others for your pain and start understanding your own patterns. When a man embraces this path, he stops chasing women and starts attracting them. Not because of tricks or strategies, but because stillness is magnetic. His energy no longer leaks through neediness, it consolidates into presence. He becomes rare, the kind of man who cannot be manipulated because he is not seeking approval. The kind of man who can love fiercely without losing himself. And when a woman meets such a man, something ancient awakens within her. She remembers the archetype of the feminine that can finally surrender, not out of weakness, but out of reverence. She doesn't need to fight for control because she feels secure in the presence of truth. That is the union the modern world has forgotten, not a contract between two fragile egos, but a dance between two awakened forces. Masculine and feminine, order and chaos, direction and flow. When they meet in consciousness, love ceases to be a transaction and becomes a transformation. So if you've been broken, betrayed, disillusioned, let it strip you bare. Let it destroy every fantasy that kept you asleep. Because only the man who has lost everything false can finally embody what is real. He no longer seeks the perfect woman, he seeks truth. He no longer runs from loneliness, he faces it until it becomes solitude. And in that solitude, something extraordinary happens, he becomes whole. And when a whole man meets a whole woman, there is no dependence, no addiction, no fear. There is just presence, two beings standing naked before each other, without masks, without games, without illusions. That is love after illusion. That is what remains when the fire of desire burns away everything that isn't true. That is depth of men.